Welcome everyone to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. Today we're joined from Israel by Yaakov Katz. Everyone in the shul knows Yaakov. He spoke on behalf of Federation this past year in our shul. He's been there many times. Many of us know the Katz family very well because he's a Chicagoan, despite the fact that he has been Magshim, fulfilled a vision which many of us have, a dream of making Aliyah and really making a difference in the state of Israel. Yaakov today is the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. In the past, he was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. He was the military correspondent of Jerusalem Post. He was a senior policy advisor for Naftali Bennett. He is the author of two books. One is The Shadow War in the Israel versus Iran, The Shadow War, and the other is Weapons. And I all of a sudden can't read my own handwriting, Yaakov. Weapons, what was the rest of that one?
Weapon Wizards, and then my latest book, which came out a year ago, called Shadow Strike.
Shadow Strike, that's the one. Yeah. The Shadow Strike, right. And all of them are really fascinating. And what I find so amazing is that some of them have been translated into Czech, Polish, I think Mandarin?
Mandarin, yes.
Mandarin in Hebrew, which at some point we may have a chance to talk about actually why specifically those languages need to know about Israeli military, but I have a feeling that there's some really fascinating answers to that as well. So Yaakov, thank you so much for joining us. And let me just start out with a simple thing, the most complicated questions of all, Israeli politics. July 1st, according to the agreement between Benny Gantz and Bibi, there was a permission to be able to start the conversations about annexation of sections of Yehuda and Shomron. And it didn't happen, as far as we know. What's going on with the annexation issue?
Well, first of all, Rabbi Matanki, let me just say it's a pleasure to be with you virtually. I was in Kins in January, like you mentioned, when I came to speak on behalf of the JUF. And I got to meet Rabbi Bressler. These were the days when we used to fly on those machines called airplanes. And I think you were then on a rabbinic delegation somewhere in Europe, if I'm not mistaken. That's what they told me. So
in Venice, I missed COVID there by about a month.
So we missed each other at the time. So it's really great to be here. And I'll also just say that ever since now I'm probably a little older, a more veteran reporter, but ever since I was a young reporter coming through Chicago, you always were gracious and hosted me at the shul. So I appreciate that, and thank you again. When it comes to Israeli politics, it's impossible to know. Just today, for example, one of the big stories was that there was an initiative brought to the Knesset by an opposition MK from the Amina party, that's Naftali Bennett, Ayelet Shaked's party, to establish a commission of inquiry into conflicts of interest that Supreme Court justices might have. So initially it would come, and any opposition initiative that comes to the Knesset for a vote is usually knocked down by the coalition majority government. But this time Netanyahu said, the Likud will vote in favor of it. Benny Gantz of blue and white, right, because this is this unity government, Benny Gantz goes ahead and says, voting in favor of this would be declaring war on democracy. I won't let it happen. And this set off like 2 hours of mudslinging back and forth between the two of them and their different members of their parties. And it just makes you wonder a number of things. First of all, we're facing a surge in infections, unfortunately, across Israel. Close to 1 million Israelis out of 9 million. So that's a ninth of our country, which is more when you look at the number of people who participate in the workforce. But the unemployment is surging over 30%. 1 million people almost are out of jobs. All gyms, wedding halls shut down. Public transportation now limited to only till 10 p.m. The country is going into a lockdown once again because we did well, but then we opened up too fast probably. We could talk about that maybe, but now things are out of hand. And this is what they're dealing with. Like, this is what they're fighting about. So it just makes you wonder on one level of where are they? How are they not focused on what's really important right now, which is saving lives? Number two, is it makes you question the whole validity of this government, right? I mean, they were supposed to come together in a unity government to solve the big issues that we're dealing with. You spoke about, we were speaking about annexation before, and instead they're focused on this stuff, which is, pardon me, but nonsense at the moment, right? When we have really big issues that need to be dealt with. So this is a complicated reality that I'm afraid is just the nature today of Israeli politics, which are so polarized and will continue for some time to come.
Is it really different than politics in the United States? Politics are polarized all around the world today. Things are black and white. Why? I know we should always expect better from the Jewish state, but why do you think it's different?
Well, I think we should definitely expect more from the Jewish state. We should expect more from our leaders in general across the board, no matter where they are, at least in democracies where we, the people, have the opportunity to raise a hand or slip in a ballot or press a button and impact what decisions are made and who's elected, as is in the case in your country and in my country. But for the time being, the fact of the matter is that in Israel, my concern is that, remember, we were in 17 to 18 months of elections, 3 elections. The government fell in December of 2018, and this one was established in May of 2020. So we had this 17, 18-month period where we just kept on going mudslinging back and forth between Gantz and Netanyahu. I mean, I can tell you that up until Gantz's decision to go into government with Netanyahu, I met him just a few weeks before, and he said to me, "I'll never believe a word he says. He's a liar. You can't believe a word the man says." 2 weeks later, he's going into his government. So all that bad feeling doesn't just disappear. It doesn't evaporate. The polarization and the animosity and the hostility and the ugly, ugly, ugly campaigns that the two of them ran against one another, basically negating the other. It was almost 2 years, Rabbi Mitenki, of negation, of just saying I won't sit with him, I won't sit with him. He's corrupt, he's corrupt. That was this. Now that creates a culture and an environment that is not healthy. It's not healthy for a country, and it's very difficult to repair that. One of the things that they decided in their government when they established it was they were going to create they called it a cabinet pius, a reconciliation cabinet. Ask me how many times that reconciliation cabinet has convened in the last 2 months. 0.
So when we talk about, in American Jewry, the issue of annexation was something we were expecting to be explosive, and everyone was trying to prepare for it. I was on a task force from the Federation in Chicago trying to decide if and what anything should be said when Israel makes its decision of what it's going to do, because we were expecting, something would happen and it would explode. Is something going to happen with annexation, or do you think it's going to be some small thing that Gush will be included, will be annexed, or Ma'ale Adumim, or nothing?
So first, let me just say on a zoomed out perspective for a moment, on a macro level, is that when it comes to the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, Israel has been in possession of this territory now for 53 years. This past June was the 53rd year anniversary since the 6-Day War. The time has come for Israel to decide what it wants to do and where does it want to start to set its borders. Now, for years, yes, we've tried to negotiate with the Palestinians, and we've tried to reach peace accords with them. And there was the Oslo Accords, and there were the Y Agreement, and there was Barak's Camp David talks with Yasser Arafat and Ehud Olmert's offer to Mahmoud Abbas back in 2008, and Netanyahu's freezing of settlement construction during the Obama years, and on and on and on. But we're not getting anywhere. And I think that there is value in making decisions. So, but before we dive into just annexation on a specific level, I will just mention that I think there's a problem that we as a country are consistently waiting for someone to present us with a plan, right? We wait for the Clinton parameters, the Bush roadmap, the Obama initiative, whatever, the Kerry initiative, whatever it might be. And now the Trump peace plan deal of the century. We are an independent sovereign state that is capable of making decisions in our best interest. Remember 1981 when Menachem Begin passed the Golan Bill in less than 24 hours. He went to the Knesset, passed it in his cabinet, ran to the Knesset, passed it through 3 readings, and Israel applied its laws and sovereignty to the Golan. In 1967, just weeks after the 6-Day War, Levi Eshkol did the same thing in East Jerusalem. Once upon a time, we knew how to make these decisions because we knew what was in our best interest. Now, for that, I open with that because that's an important part of the discussion. Because we have a U.S. administration that now what's changed the paradigm to some extent, the parameters, is that the Trump administration is the first U.S. administration to say we will recognize your application of law. So that's a big deal, right? And no one else will recognize it. Now the question is, what can we do? The plan speaks of 30%. Benny Gantz, though, is not willing to go with 30%. That's too much. But he's not willing to say exactly what he's willing to go with, right? You talk to him, and I've spoken with the American side, and they were here last week for talks, and there's a feeling that Benny Gantz is very wishy-washy. He doesn't want to commit himself. So he'll say, I don't want to annex too much, but I don't want to annex too little. I don't want to give the Palestinians a prize, but I also don't want to, punish them. I don't want to control Palestinians, but I also want to get as much territory as possible. So what exactly does that mean? No one yet understands. And I also think that Netanyahu, to some extent, wants to do it, but to some extent also doesn't want to do it. And it could be that the surge in COVID in Israel could be a way out of this whole thing for Netanyahu to kind of push it aside. What we're waiting for, essentially, and the signals that I'm getting from the administration, we ran a story today in the newspaper that the U.S. is still ready for some move on annexation in the month of July. They don't want to go beyond that, because one of the Trump administration concerns is that if you wait too long, it gets close to the elections, and if something bad happens, a spill out of violence, it could be tagged to the elections, and Trump could be seen as being reckless, which is something he doesn't want to be seen as. So they would like to do something in July, but there's a lot of balls up in the air right now.
Is the difference in Israeli politics, and maybe this is too simplistic, between when you look at an Eshkol and a Begin, you're dealing with ideologues versus classic politicians of today? That years ago in college, in a political science course, Professor Yaakov taught us the first rule of politics as a politician tries to do as little as he can about as much as he can for as long as he can, because people remember the bad and forget the good. So are we dealing with politicians instead of ideologues, and we're just going to continue these kind of patterns, or what's going on in Israel?
I think that's part of it. I think we're also dealing with people who, there's a reason why in the United States you have term limits. There's a reason why Netanyahu himself said in the past that he's in favor of term limits. Of course, not now, right? But once upon a time he was. And one of the reasons that term limits are always spoken about as an important tool for any democracy is because what you're not going to get done in your first term, and you're not going to get done in your second term, you're probably not going to get done at all, right? And there's a reason why no one should stay in the same role for so long. You need to refresh, you need to renew. Transition is important, and it's good for any society and any institution. So I think that, yes, we have at least in Israel, I can say we have a politician who's very, whose focus right now, singular focus, is how does he stay in power? How does he remain on his seat? How does he try to avoid being convicted in court? Remember the conjunction now of his trial with everything that's going on creates an anomaly that we've never experienced before, that probably we should never have experienced to begin with. And I hope that he comes out innocent, but it's unhealthy for any society or democracy to have a prime minister or leader who's on trial and at the same time making life and death decisions. You question every decision, right? In Israel, the Reverend Tanki, the education system, as you know, is a public system. If you are a teacher on trial, you can't be a teacher. If you are a police officer, you can't be in trial. You can't be a police officer. You can't be a minister. You can't be a Knesset member. I wouldn't be able to be in my job, but for some reason you can stay as a prime minister. There's something a little off in this whole reality.
So I want to shift gears for a minute, because by the time we're done, if we continue this way, people will be really ready for the 3 weeks. Let's talk about good stuff. Like, what's exciting about Israel that should get us really proud of what's going on today?
Look, I think that one of the, Israel today is an amazing country. I mean, as we speak, a couple hours ago, Intel announced, just as an example, right? When you talk about technology, Intel announced that this new port cable, the Thunderbolt 4 or something like that, is rolled out, of course, made here in Israel, right? You look at, even throughout COVID, the rounds of exits and investments in tech companies continue almost at the same rate that they were continuing in the pre-COVID days to a large extent. I look at Israeli society, I'll tell you, in the beginning, in the first wave, when it was really bad and we locked down, we stayed home and we listened to the regulations because we understood as a people, the Israeli people as a people have experience of going through times of crisis. They know what they need to do and they know how to listen to orders, right? Unfortunately now, there's a lot of reasons why things have changed in that, but they knew when they were told to stay home, they stayed home. Right, when they were told they had to limit contact, they limited contact. It wasn't a foreign idea for them, right? When we were told we couldn't leave a 100-meter radius of our homes, we didn't do that, because when we were told we can't go into buses or we can't walk or we have to go into a bomb shelter, Israeli people know how to do that. And that talks to resilience of the Israeli people, which I think is something that we've all seen in one way or another over the years. Now, unfortunately, that's not exactly what's happening with the battle of the coronavirus, but I think that what you see also in Corona, and this is something that really moved me, and maybe you saw these videos as well. There was one in particular where you saw an Arab nurse in a geriatric center reading the Manishtana on Leila Seder for the patients. There was a video of an Arab doctor carrying a Sefer Torah into a coronavirus ward. Right, there were pictures of Muslim paramedics praying to Allah and pictures alongside a Jewish paramedic laying tefillin and a talit. Right, so we talk about what we spoke about before. Right, unfortunate, this division, the polarization. That's part of our story. But this, I think, this is what shook me. This is what moved me to tears when I saw this. It told me that we can be better. This is who we actually can be. This is what we need to strive to be as a nation.
And in terms of the religious Zionist community within Israel, are they stepping up to these challenges? Are they part of this story?
I think to a very large extent. I mean, you see them on the front lines of, whether it's in Magen David Adom or United Hatzalah, or the doctors and the nurses. And, I've actually, you're in Chicago, but there's a nurse who lives right behind me from St. Louis originally, so not too far away, who I see almost every day going out on Shabbat, on the Chagim, on her way to work in COVID wards. An Orthodox lady. There were recent numbers that came out of Tzahal in the graduation class of the new Katzinim, of the new officers, and you saw that the numbers there were almost 50% of Dati boys who are becoming Katzinim or becoming officers in the IDF. And if you go back 30, 40, 50 years ago, they weren't there, right? These were the kibbutznikim, these were the secular Israelis, the religious, the modern, the observant, or Dati Lumi, as you said. They've stepped up to the plate in a very big way in shouldering the burden of what Israel is about, which is definitely military service. And to that, we should salute them.
So, shifting again, can we talk a little bit about Iran? This last week, there were some mysterious fires that were taking place in nuclear facilities. Israel has been accused of having been behind it, which on the one hand actually made me a little proud that the first people you think who could do something like this are the Israelis. I'm not sure if it's true or not. What's the word in Israel about these things? Was it significant? Was it us? Was it something entirely different and we just get blamed for it?
Well, your average Israeli right now doesn't care. The average Israeli doesn't care about Iran, doesn't care about annexation. Those are the last things on his or her mind. They're worried about the virus, and they're mostly worried about their jobs, right? And unfortunately, we're seeing that is something that is not stable at the moment. But when it does come to Iran, I think what we're seeing is something very interesting, quite fascinating, as a matter of fact. The most interesting strike was the one that took place just a few days ago, last week, against the Natanz uranium enrichment facility. Natanz, remember, is mostly an underground bunker. It's an underground facility where the Iranians have installed most of their centrifuges. Those are those steel machines, these cascades, that spin around to enrich uranium, which is a key component for a nuclear program, a nuclear weapon program, also nuclear power. But there was a mysterious explosion at a structure above ground, a relatively new structure, where apparently the Iranians were constructing new and more sophisticated centrifuges, the kinds that it would need if it were to try to enrich uranium to higher levels, to enrich it to higher military grade levels, which is the levels that you would require for a nuclear weapon. Who would have an interest in carrying out such an explosion or an attack? would definitely be Israel, also the United States for that matter. The Natanz facility was targeted back in 2010 with the Stuxnet virus at the time, which was a joint Israeli-US operation known as Olympic Games, which with a cyber worm, if we could call it that, was infiltrated the facility and infected the main control systems that basically centrifuges spin at very, very quickly, but if you change it too fast, the frequency, they could break. They're very delicate. And this way, Israel and the United States wiped out over 1,000 centrifuges in a very short period of time and set back the Iranian nuclear program by at least a year, if not even 2. We have an interest. I don't know that it's Israel. I know that Israel is constantly operating against the Iranians. I know that the US is too, but you see this string of explosions. The Iranians have a lot of old infrastructure, so that's a problem. I don't think that everything necessarily is sabotage. But Israel has an interest in doing this, and let's keep in mind 2 other just important things. One is that in October, the UN will have to debate a renewing an arms embargo on the Iranians, right? Iran is involved in every bad thing that's taking place in the Middle East. Pompeo just an hour ago, the U.S. Secretary of State announced that the U.S. had seized an Iranian arms ship on its way to arm the Houthis in Yemen. A couple days ago, there were rockets fired from Gaza into Israel. We know of Hezbollah's continued hold over Lebanon with its 100,000 plus rockets and missiles capable of covering all of Israel, an Iranian proxy. The arms embargo is important, but the other important part to keep in mind is that with COVID, with unemployment, with the world instability, someone out there, maybe Israel, is basically saying, this doesn't stop us for 1 second. We go and we're after and we're taking on this threat head on. And I think that's an important message. If I'm the Iranians, I'm concerned. But if I'm the world, I'm impressed. So there's 2 sides to that coin. And
can you imagine, after the elections in America, there are obviously 2 major candidates. President Trump will continue, or Vice President Biden will come in. Will the support for Israel after the elections, if it becomes a Democratic administration, shift in a major way in your mind?
Look, I think it'll change. Definitely it'll change because you'll have a different administration that looks at Israel differently, right? The policies of Trump are not the policies of Joe Biden. And that's clear to everyone. One thing that Biden has said, for example, and this was an issue that people had asked about, and Biden has clarified, he's not going to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv. Okay, so that's, at least one nice thing. But what would happen with annexation? And by the way, here I'll actually say that the Trump administration, I think, has been working smart, because one of the things that they said early on is that we want buy-in from Benny Gantz, because Netanyahu could pass it without Gantz. He has the votes in the cabinet. He definitely has the votes in the Knesset. But if Gantz doesn't support it, Biden, let's say, wins in November, comes in January and says, 1 second, I need to be more Zionist than the guy who's about to become prime minister of Israel, right? I don't recognize the annexation. On the other hand, if all of Israel in the government recognizes it, supports it, even if it's a smaller scale, that, Biden might be willing to swallow that. Potentially, I don't know. But Israel needs to be prepared. I mean, Rabbi Matenki, I know you've worked on this and you've dealt with this issue, but bipartisan support is extremely important for the state of Israel. And unfortunately, we've seen that being chipped away over the years. Partially, I think, our fault, partially the trends that have been taking place in the Democratic Party that have nothing to do with Israel, but are happening on their own. But I think that because we know that this pendulum swings back and forth, that just shows why bipartisanship is so important for Israel, because we need to have friends on both sides of the aisle, and I'm concerned that might not be the case.
And Iran, do you feel that the Iran issue we have on both sides, or is the Obama doctrine and approach going to be continued if we have a Democratic?
Look, I can tell you that last summer I was in Washington, D.C., and I actually had the opportunity to meet with Secretary Pompeo in his office at the State Department. And he's got this big conference table. And I said to him, so when are the Iranians coming here, right, to sit down and renegotiate the nuclear deal? And he said to me, and this has continued to be the U.S. answer, is that they don't expect them to come, and they never expected them to come until they see what happens in November. Everyone's waiting on November. If Trump wins, the Iranians probably will have no choice but to come to the table, because they won't be able to sustain another 4 years of economic clampdown, crackdown, of the being strangled, of the difficulty with the sanctions. The Palestinians are waiting in the same vein, right? They want to see what's going to happen. Everyone wants to see if Joe Biden wins, for example, the Iranians get to go back to the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal that Obama reached with them. And everything's great from their perspective. The Palestinians also, Trump peace plan for prosperity goes out the window. And they go back to probably what was back then. Remember, President Obama was the first president who embraced and called for the establishment of a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders. So everyone's playing a waiting game at the moment. I think that we will also, Israel will have to wait to see. But this also creates this window now when it comes to annexation of being able to do something.
Well, but the argument again is that if you annex now and Biden would come in and he would undo it, it would be much worse than having never done it.
Very true. And therefore, I think that we have to be smart. And I'll just refer back to what I said in the beginning. It shouldn't be dependent on Trump, Biden, what the U.S. says. We also have to decide what we want, right? I mean, I think, and that's something that these consecutive governments for too long have sanctified, or something, if we could say that, the status quo. They've turned that into the ultimate objective. But the status quo can't stay forever, and we do have to decide one way or the other what we want to do.
Do you see leadership on the horizon that are going to do those tough decisions, are going to do it from an Israel perspective as opposed to being responsive to other allies?
Maybe my kids' generation. No, I mean, look, I think there are people in the Knesset. There are very principled politicians who I see in currently in the government. But I think that also part of the problem in our system, as an example of a coalition system, is it constrains you from the right, from the left. It's very difficult to make big moves. That's maybe a good thing because it creates checks and balances, but it also makes it difficult to get stuff done. I think it's possible. I mean, look, you look at Netanyahu. Ultimately, at any point throughout his last 11 years in office as prime minister, if he wanted to annex territory, he could have done it. If he wanted to make big concessions to the Palestinians, he could have done that too. But one of the things that the Palestinians are asking, the Americans are asking for in exchange for annexation right now, is that Israel take a little slice of territory that's now in Area C, right? Under the Oslo Accords, you have Area A, which is controlled completely by the Palestinians, B, which is half Palestinian, half Israeli, and C, which is completely Israeli. So take part of a little slice of Area C and transfer it to become B so the Palestinians can build. Now, it means nothing. It's a tiny piece of land. It's nowhere near anything that is Israeli. But Netanyahu can't do it because the moment he would give up a forfeit, a piece of Area C, the right wing would go ballistic. But it might be the right thing for us to do, so why not do it, right? And I think that's where we're constantly caught in this political game, and it doesn't help us.
And as editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, is this political game what keeps the paper vibrant?
Look, I will tell you that, one of the things that I've experienced over the last few months with the coronavirus is unprecedented readership. We've reached numbers that I would not have believed are possible and sustained them for such a long period of time. I think this is something that's a common for all large news organizations around the world with international readership, is people are hungry for any piece of information, especially about the coronavirus. But thankfully in Israel, we have other issues that draw people's attention: annexation, Iran, and just the general political mayhem that we have here. But what I think people, I can see what people like to read, right? That's the beauty of online today, of digital, is you have analytics. So I can see what they like to read. I can see where they come from. I can see how long they spend in the article and how far down in the article they get as well, which is why I tell my writers to try to keep it concise and short, but which is sometimes difficult for us writers. But people like a number of stories. It's almost like Pride and Prejudice, right? They like to be proud of what Israel achieves, and like that Intel story I mentioned before. But they also people like to read about where they feel that Israel's being discriminated or biased or getting a bad end of the deal. And definitely COVID is a hot topic right now. But what we try to do is I think tell Israel's story in its completeness as much as that's possible, right? So have stories about matters of religion and state, the tech sector, obviously our diplomacy and our politics and Palestinian affairs, but also try to bring culture and tell personal stories. We have one up online right now about young couples that were supposed to be getting married and sadly can't get married right now, right? Or in the arts and culture scene, how have they adapted with not being able to hold shows, right? How have those artists and musicians been able to fare throughout this storm? So we try to tell Israel's story as much as we can.
And story is what we're very interested in. It's deep in the heart of every Jewish person. The Jerusalem Post is really one of our key sources. And Yaakov, it's a great source of pride that one of our Chicagoans is the editor-in-chief and so articulate. Our time is up. I want to thank you again, send my best regards to your family, and really thank you for helping enlighten us, both this half hour, but especially every single day. And I look forward every Erev Shabbos when I get your column as well. I read those. So you can check the analytics on 60645. You'll see you have.
Thank you very much, Reverend.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe and have an easy fast tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.